was difficult times here in Berlin. The paper mill changed hands 4 or 5 times over the last 20 years. And every time that the paper mill changed hands, there was always that hope that that was going to continue and continue to provide good employment for lots of people. But when the pulp mill was finally sold to a demolition company and most of it was demolished, I think that finally broke the mold and broke the mindset. And I think the majority of the residents here in Berlin are ready for Berlin to take a new direction.
It was an end of an era. The mill had been sold, and the top part of it, the Burgess mill, had 3 huge smokestacks. They were going to dynamite the 3 smokestacks. My mom's house happened to be the closest to the mill. I grew up right next to the mill, and we had front row seats to this demolition. They did the horn, and after that, 5 seconds later, you heard a bang, and you saw one of the smokestacks fall. Within 10 minutes of the first one, they hit the horn, fire in a hole, the second one fell, and everyone clapped. And the third one was the closest to my mother's house, and we were right there. We were like, maybe 100 yards away. So they hit the horn, bang, nothing happened. All right, fire in a hole, we're gonna do it again. So you hear the horn, bang, again, nothing. Well, apparently when they had made these smokestacks, this one in particular, they had put a lot of steel rebar in there, which really made it really strong and stuff. And so what they were doing now, instead of putting another charge, they had a couple of people with torches, and they started to cut the rebar at the bottom. And all of a sudden, you could start seeing the tower slowly start falling. And everyone said, "Look, it's going," right? So we were watching, and as we watched it, it fell. And as soon as it hit, we're not sure it hit a lot of debris that was on the ground or the stack itself. All of a sudden, it started coming towards us. My wife was on the porch. They were ducking. Me and my sister were in the front. We were ducking, hiding behind things, and it didn't last more than 10, 15 seconds. But when we got up, we couldn't believe all the damage it had done from that chimney falling and stuff. And like I said, my mother's house had several $1,000s worth of damage because of the rocks that hit the house. The mill was part of our life. It was, it was a symbol of the town, the paper mill of Berlin and everything. And then when they finally did fall and stuff, and they fell, it was an end of an era,
There's just something so magical about this area, and something that really needs to be preserved.
The mill activity, the sporting activity, we are rich in sports history. We used to be called Hockey Town USA, and we lost that title. All the people that have lived here, all the different nationalities that have come and gone.
We not only had French Canadians, we had Italians, we had Russians, we had the Norwegians. So it was really, it was very much a very active melting pot and mixing pot of the culture.
For me, it was interesting just to learn who all these people were and what they did. Did they work in the mill? Did they work at Converse Rubber Company? Did they work out of town?
They all contributed to this city, and every one of them, they have to be preserved.
I just liked people, and I liked learning about their stories and learning about the past as well as, the present.
I think that's very important. This deep feeling about your community, your street, the people in it.
It's a close-knit city, and everybody who grew up together, we're still together.
I hope that future generations will continue to be proud of Berlin and that they will try to continue their roots. so we won't completely lose our heritage.
In the early 20th century, it was the largest producer of paper in the world. Its neighborhoods were a patchwork quilt of ethnic diversity. Irish Acres, Little Canada, Russian Hill, and Norwegian Village. There were churches of every major denomination, sports teams of every kind, and winter carnivals that drew people from miles around. Berlin, New Hampshire in the 20th century was America personified. A thriving economy, an ethnic melting pot, and a good place to raise a family and live your life. This is the story of that community. It is a story of resilience, a story of grit and determination, and the story of a proud people struggling to maintain their cultural and historical heritage into the 21st century. First settled by William Sessions and others from Maine in 1823, the small town of Mainsboro only had a population of 65 when it was incorporated as Berlin in 1829. Located 115 miles north of Concord, New Hampshire, and only 64 miles southeast of the Canadian border, in its early history, Berlin consisted mainly of small farms and sawmills. But there were two things that would soon make this young city the center of the universe in the production of paper: the Androscoggin River and the Great Northern Forest.
What made Berlin and what lured industry to Berlin was the Androscoggin River and the power that it had. Over a 1 mile distance, the river dropped 200 feet. And no place in New England is there a river that drops that far over such a short distance.
So that one section, that 1 mile section or so that drops through Berlin, 200 feet, the pioneers figured out, you know, there's power there. And it was time to use it.
These two pristine natural resources would attract loggers and entrepreneurs from surrounding states, Canada, and Scandinavia. And in the early and mid-1800s, mills were built along the river and the woods harvested for their prized timber.
When these mills, all these paper mills and sawmills were operating and Berlin was booming, they were only using 20% of the power that that river was producing. That's how powerful the river was. It had pitches and turns and drops. And the pioneers that came here and the engineers that came here later on used all of that.
It was soon realized that Berlin occupied what was known as the Great Pitch on the Androscoggin, making it a prime location for generating the energy needed to run the mills. With the introduction of the turbine to help generate power from the flowing water and new rail connections in Berlin, the city was poised to be a major economic engine in the North Country, the region, and the world. Many smaller sawmills had cropped up along the Androscoggin, but no one had truly harnessed the enormous power of the river for major industrial purposes. That was all about to change. In 1852, a group of Maine businessmen opened the Winslow Sawmill. Purchased by W. Brown, it became the Berlin Mills Company, which became known as the Brown Company in 1917, a business and a family that would shape the history and culture of Berlin beyond the life of the company itself. The Browns followed the industrial model of the day and not only bought the mills, but the surrounding woodlands, so they could control both the product and the raw materials. The product was paper, and the material was wood.
The mill owned 600,000 acres of land, and they hired people to harvest the wood off their land, and they used the river to ship the wood down here.
The Brown Company was here because of the great water power that we had in Berlin, and also because of the natural resources as far as the trees and all the wood that those forests provided, to make the paper.
As the company grew in scope, word spread that lumberjacks were needed in Berlin to help harvest the vast tracts of woodland owned by the Brown Company. Word went to the Canadian provinces, around New England, and across the Atlantic to Scandinavian countries, as well as Eastern and Central Europe.
There was a pretty large group of Norwegians that came to Berlin and settled in this area because of the logging industry. W.W. Brown invited Jan Oswald to come to Berlin. And Jan Oswald was a recruiter. He would write back to Tooten and say, there's plenty of jobs over here, there's plenty of work, and the scenery is very much like the section of Norway that he came from.
Soon lumberjacks from around the nation and around the globe were pouring into Berlin, New Hampshire to work for the Brown Company, helping it to become the leading producer of paper in the world. In the period following World War I, the Brown Company began to assemble one of the finest research laboratories in the nation, bringing top scientists from around the United States to Berlin, New Hampshire, and establishing the company as the leading innovator in its field.
The Brown Company was just probably the most technologically advanced company in the world as far as the paper industry was concerned.
The Brown Company was flourishing, and they had brought a lot of professional people to town. They had the research department, which had a lot of very well-educated people.
From 48 until 84, I worked for the Brown Company. When I was first hired, I was hired more or less as a general researcher. That would be to work in newer areas and on more academic-like products.
The Brown Company had a research team that was second to none. We had a lot of the greatest minds in the country that ended up by coming here and developing a lot of the different products that became mainstays for the country. Things like Crisco. Crisco was developed here. And when it was developed, it was called Cream of Crisp.
We had an experimental paper machine, which is actually just a running model of a small machine, which could make all kinds of things from tissue to papers of every description, impregnated papers and papers with other additives.
They had what they called the Brown Company store. It was right up on Main Street. So people that worked in the mill could buy all their groceries, their clothing, their sporting goods, furniture at the Brown Company store. And the way that operated was, if you worked in the mill, you went over and bought your stuff, they'd put a slip on it, they would take it out of your paycheck. So they try to help their employees that way.
Without doubt, the mills had such an impact on the whole region.
The Brown Company was basically why we're all here. And they gave jobs to the people who, whether they came from Canada or they came from other parts of the country, or even from other countries, overseas. This was a mecca for opportunity.
Typical of many business owners in the Gilded Age, the Brown family lived in grand style. But unlike many of the robber barons of the day, they were philanthropists who added to the quality of life in Berlin.
Brown family was such a good family, and what they did for the city and everything, it's like, to me, that's very, very important to save. We kind of feel a kinship to the Browns now.
The Browns were very, I would say, not to use the term loosely, but they were Berlin's royalty.
They did things early on like introducing the traveling nurse program. They had a first kindergarten in town, which they built. They were generous in supporting activities, sports teams. They brought in hockey players to build a hockey team in Berlin. They backed baseball teams. They supported any of the organizations in town.
They brought a flair to Berlin, you know, with their finesse and their generosity and the way they did things.
Kobe Brown lived on a corner not far from here. In the winter, they had a skating rink in front of the house because there was a lot of land. All the neighborhood kids were encouraged to go skating there. They just did. And they would go skating there and skiing in their yard because it was a nice slope. And in the summer, it was tennis.
I lived adjacent to the Brown estate, which was O.B. Brown's, which was one of the original Browns and Brown Company. And he had a nice hill in his yard, so we all sledded there, and he didn't mind it a bit. And he had a clay tennis court, and in the summertime, they had long since stopped using it for tennis. That became our baseball field.
At noontime, they would call everybody in, or they'd call in, how many are you, you know, and they'd say, oh, there's 10 of us or whatever. They'd serve lunch to all of them.
I just remember my mom telling me when the Browns they'd come onto High Street and go into town on their horses just for, you know, like a casual stroll. They were all in their riding clothes and, you know, with the knee boots, and it was something that not every community had. And it was just kind of, I won't say something that you would have expected more in a fairy tale. But here you have this industrial complex that's billowing smoke, and here you have, you know, the people who essentially run the town parading on their horses and being friendly to everybody.
They interacted with the neighbors, and a lot of the people that worked for them, they were actually friends of the Browns. And they would lend out even their Arabian horses to them for races and the winter carnivals and everything.
They bought a lot of the timberlands around here. The timberlands were always open for hunting. They let people have leases on them so they could have hunting camps at various places. So the Browns were very good neighbors.
And there wasn't a distance with the Brown family. They were people that were very much intertwined with the community.
They were involved in everything. They were really, really, to me, our royal family, if there's anything like that.
The most colorful employees of the Brown Company were the lumberjacks and river drivers. Rugged men who came from around the world to work in the forests and helped drive the lumber across the lakes and down the rivers to Berlin. River drives began early in the company's history and continued into the 1960s.
Talking about the loggers, they all left in November. And they would travel up into the woods, all along the waterways. And they would spend all winter long cutting wood. All that wood was headed for Berlin. And at one point in time, there were 6,000 men working in the woods, along with the thousands of men that were working in the mills.
My father was a lumberjack. They were gone for months at a time. And They came home like during mud season, which would have been in March and April. So my sister was born in December, my brother was born in November, and I was born in December. Figure it out. It was mud season.
Now, by the time April came, and all the logs were piled on the lakes and alongside the river, the wood would be put into the brooks, brought to a lake, pulled across the lake by boats, brought to another lake. Sometimes 4 lakes it would cross until it got to the Androscoggin River. And this is where the famous river driver came in, because it was his job, okay, to get those logs moving. They had to get them down a brook. They had to get them either in a lake. They had to get them to the river, and they would jam up, and they'd have to get on these logs. And they'd have to struggle to get these jams undone. They used dynamite. They used sheer muscle.
The thing to watch was the men when they had to work on those logs to separate them, and they were out on those logs. Just they had these spiked shoes, so they could grip into the logs as they were walking on these logs going across the river. And they had these long pick poles to move the logs. People go up there to watch them when they were doing that.
Those men worked hard. Many, and I want to say 80% of those men could not swim. So when they fell, they were in danger. When they fell, the logs would come over them. Many men were saved, but many lives were lost. It was a tough job.
I think a lot of the lumberjacks were working hard, you know, a whole week long or sometimes a whole month long in their lumber camps in the woods. And when they come back to town and had money in their pockets, they really wanted to let it go. They wanted a taste of life and swinging and all that went with it. So they come out and they spent a lot of money and raised a lot of heck and had an awful good time.
You go down Pleasant Street, there'd be 1, 2, 3, 4 beer joints there. When they come down for the wood, of course, those guys would go for a few beers, and sometimes they get out of hand, you know.
They're gone. Those men that did that, they went when we stopped bringing logs down the river. So they're like the cowboy. He doesn't exist anymore, the cowboy. You know, if you want to see a cowboy, well, they'll act as a cowboy. If you want to see a river driver, they'd have to act as one. So those days are gone. But it was all because of the river that these things were made.
The influx of workers from around the globe helped to establish a mosaic of ethnically defined neighborhoods in the ever-growing city of Berlin. These neighborhoods not only reflected, but shaped this city well into the 20th century as the power and prestige of the Brown Company grew.
You had not only the Franco-Americans, but you also had the Irish, you had the Germans, you had the Russians and the Germans and the Poles, and you had, of course, the Jewish people on both the Russian and German sides. You had the Scandinavians. They were definitely separating the neighborhoods, but a lot of the neighborhoods overlapped.
There were probably 10 distinct neighborhoods. Down on Western Avenue, you approached Cascade and Cascade Hill and Cascade Flats, where all the Italians lived, and they ended up living around there because when the Brown Company built the Cascade newsprint mill in 1902, they built the largest newsprint mill in the world, and they wanted to build it out of brick. So they hired stonemasons, and the stonemasons that they hired were people who landed on Ellis Island. They were all Italian. Then that spilled over into the south end of Berlin on Western Avenue. So you had people that spoke Italian down there, and as you came up Western Avenue, you approached what they call Russian Hill, and where the Russian church is today, and those people were all Russian. Of course, they spoke Russian.
Well, my father and mother came from the Ukraine. I remember growing up as a kid that there were 400 Russian people here. That was the most that has ever been here. That's children and parents and so on. And while we were growing up, we had 5 Russian boarders that lived with us. They paid $15 a week for board and room. My mother fed them every day, did their laundry every week.
You had the French primarily on the east side because there was a very strong French church over there.
I grew up in like a French neighborhood right across the street from Angel Guardian Elementary School. I attended St. Pat's Elementary School because I didn't know French. And Angel Guardian Elementary School, it was basically, I want to say, 90% French the whole day. So that's why I would travel a mile away to go to St. Pat's. But of course, everyone in my neighborhood went to that school, Angel Guardian.
You had Irish Acre, which is the neighborhood we're sitting in now. And then you had Norwegian Village, which was up north.
The east side did have a small population of Germans. Goebel Street would be the hub of that.
The Germans were very good machinists and very good people to work on, build, design machines. Well, when we had 2 paper mills here, they needed people who could build equipment for the paper industry. So a lot of Germans landed here.
Everybody just brought their own histories with them. But after the years and through the years, a lot of them would start mingling, although there were still definite boundaries. They had their own cultures, of course, their languages.
When I was a little kid growing up in the Norwegian village, Norwegian was spoken in every household. The rule was you speak Norwegian in the house, but if you go out with English-speaking people, you speak English. It was very common to hear elderly or older Norwegian men and women with very heavy Norwegian accents trying to speak English, which was quite funny.
We talked French all the time at home because my parents were French Canadian, and so we were first generation American. Very few people we knew that didn't talk French. Some, but very few. It was mostly French neighborhoods we lived in.
If you'd go to somebody's house, if the grandparents were there, they would be speaking in a native language, or they would be seeing some foods that you never saw before. When you go over to some of the French places, I'd never eaten meat pie.
Well, at Christmas time, you know, there was always a turkey, but there were always the French meat pies, the tourtières, as they called them. That was always, we're waiting for Mom's batch of tourtières, and everybody had to taste and sample that, along with all the other goodies. They were, in the spring of the season, they were what they called crepes. That had French tradition to it, Canadian tradition, and you know, there was just something going all the time that we enjoyed having at a certain time of year. The new batch of maple syrup that came with it. People were producing syrup and comparing from Canada to home here, homegrown stuff, and that was interesting as well. You know, maple taffy runs, and it was all real good. I mean, it's very traditional, and a lot of it stayed in place.
I had some friends that were of Italian background, and their parents actually came from Italy. They had a fruit stand downtown, and they got all of their fruits from Italy. Matter of fact, the family owned an olive orchard in Italy from their other families, and they would import a lot of things.
I had never eaten a black olive till I went to his parents were Italian, and they had olive oil and olives, and I had never eaten a black olive. I was probably 12 or 13 at the time. I didn't even know what a black olive was. I thought it was spoiled, so I got to explain that. And there were some, when I played over to the Ollie's house, the grandmother who cooked, there were some desserts that were great. I don't know what the name was, but they were Scandinavian desserts, pastries that were excellent.
I grew up in the Norwegian village on Denmark Street. I had a best friend. We started playing together when we were 2 and 3, and we're still friends. And Her mother made the most wonderful meat cakes, and so she always had me there for meat cakes. And my mother would make the American cooking, and they'd swap at Christmas time. She made, her mother made sunbuckles and futtermans and all those good Norwegian things.
My grandfather, Adrian O'Neill, was a janitor for St. Karen's, and he also took on the responsibility of seeing that the nuns and the priests had lots of food from his garden. And one of the things my grandfather used to do, that he would take all the squash that he grew, and he would take a nail and score names and prayers and everything into the squash. And as the squash would grow, the nail marks would expand and they would scar over. And there was always a "Bless your little Irish heart" on the squash and someone's name. And of course everyone loved that, because maybe there'd be a short little Irish prayer or a quote or something that he would have scratched into the squash. So when you got this 20-pound squash, you also got a little bit of him along with that.
I remember my uncle telling me a story about a Jewish family that lived off the corner, probably about 3 houses down from where my father lived. And they were going to be killing some chickens one morning. This is probably back in 1917, 1918. So the kid came over to my father's house and said, "The rabbi's coming over to kosher kill all the chickens." So all the kids would gather, whether they were Catholic or Protestant or Jewish, and they'd all go watch the rabbi say his prayers and, you know, just do his prayers over these chickens that were about to be slaughtered.
As I was getting older, my mother said, "Well, the day is coming when you're going to be confirmed in the Jewish religion at the age of 13. You become a bar mitzvah, you know." And my mother had a big party. She made the cooking and everything. And I'd say my mother was one of the best Jewish cooks in Berlin.
It's a fascinating part of our past, where all the diversity would just, all the people would just come together and just sharing each other's practices and each other's religions or cultures, whatever the case was.
As the older generation was dying off, you know, and the newer generation come in, they begin to more familiar with the different religions, you know. They knew I was Jewish, it didn't bother them, and I knew they were Catholic, and I didn't, you know, I honored them. So we knew each other, you know. And that's the way it went. You know, with the Catholic religion and some of the Protestant, it's quite a difference in believing, you know.
Most of the time we all got along quite well, and I didn't appreciate the different cultures so much until I got a little older and got to think more about why these people were the way they were and where they came from, and got to appreciate it a little bit more.
At the dawn of the 20th century, the city of Berlin, New Hampshire had a population of 9,000 people. With the success of the Brown Company, the population of the city steadily grew for the next 30 years, reaching 20,000 by 1930. From 1902 until 1938, trolleys ran between Berlin and Gorham, connecting these two mill cities by rail.
Used to love to ride the trolley. I used to take it with my mother, and I used to take it with my father.
It was a nice ride. It was different, you know, than horse and buggy.
A lot of clanging, you know. Yeah. You would just hear those wheels, you know. Yeah.
We took it at the around the 8th Street Bridge. There was an A&P store right there, and you took it in front of that A&P store. It didn't cost very much because we didn't have very much. I can't remember. It was just peanuts, really, compared to now, maybe 25 cents or something like that. Ride from Berlin to Gorham, that was the biggest deal of all, on the trolley. Go into the drugstore down there and have ice cream. They had chairs, they had books that you could buy and a lot of things, and it smelled so good. Of course, they'd have to switch the seats, you know. They switch the seats this way when you're going down and switch them coming back, and it was just, well, a big experience, really. It was like you were going on a real safari. And the fact that I was going to eat when I got there, that was special, because I love to eat, still do. Then came the buses, and that was fun too. That was a different thing. But the trolley was special.
For the children of Berlin, there were always plenty of activities, but for a lot of the kids, the place to be was the community club. Formerly the YMCA, the community club was the popular hangout and central meeting place for teens and young ones alike.
The community club was a great thing because the Browns started, it was a YMCA to start with, and the Browns gave a lot of money towards it because the girls, that was before my time, of course, had their own girls club for a while. But then at a certain date, and I think it was in the 30s, they opened it up to women and they changed the name to community club.
I remember it was a $5 pass for the year, and you could swim all you wanted. And the chlorine at the time for the pool was provided by the Brown Company. And from what I remember, they paid all the heating and the electricity. So that was a really big thing for us.
We'd go to hang around the community club, sit around, talk, decide to play a little ping pong, pool, bowling alley. There was a bowling alley inside the community club.
That was almost like a meeting place between seasons, between hockey and baseball or whatever. You go there and you could candlepin bowl. They had ping pong tables, pinball tables, the track upstairs above the basketball court. It was just where everyone went and played and hung out and, you know.
You know, go work. You want to work out? Go work out. One of the guys was a boxer. And when we'd go in the gym, when he was working out, we'd go in and spar with him.
The Catholics were encouraged not to go. It was not a good place. So we never went to the community club. I remember the nuns talking about it, not to go to the community club. So we missed out on that. Then after I went to work at Converse and these girls, I went to public school. It told me the fun they had at community club because it was very well chaperoned. If anybody swore, they were out of the club. They couldn't come back. Very few Catholic girls that I talked to, and now I ask them, did you go to a community club? And then very few will say yes if they went to Catholic school. They say, oh yeah, we knew it was frowned upon, but we went anyway.
That was the greatest place to go and dance. And that was a great place to meet. All the boys would go there, all the girls would go there, and we each go home alone. We were very independent. There was no special that you just had one that you could be with. And I liked that. I liked everybody being equal.
With the population growing and the ethnic melting pot becoming more and more diverse, Berlin also became a center for recreation. The Nansen Ski Club, the oldest active ski club in the nation, was organized in 1872. In the early 20th century and well into the 1980s, the Nansen Ski Club held skiing events, hosted the United States Olympic ski jumping tryouts, and invited some of the best ski jumpers in the world to Berlin for competitions.
Originally it was called the Skiklubben Norsk-Amerikansk, and it was for Norwegian-speaking people only. And the reason why they did it was to keep the Swedes out. So if you were Swedish and spoke Norwegian, that was okay, but the club was conducted, all the meetings and everything was conducted in Norwegian, so that was the rule.
We had a great number of Scandinavians that came to the area, and a lot of the attraction was, of course, the work. And Berlin, because of its proximity near the Canadian border, is a lot like, you know, the conditions would have been in Norway and Sweden. So we had a lot of Scandinavians that came into the area, and of course they brought a lot of their traditions with them. And one of them was skiing.
When Fridtjof Nansen, the famous Arctic explorer, came to Berlin, the club members decided, in honor of Dr. Fridtjof Nansen, to change the name to Nansen Ski Club. And everyone still, you know, my grandmother's generation and my dad's generation always talked about the day that Fridtjof Nansen came to Berlin. It was just a huge honor to have him here. Back in those days, it would be like Neil Armstrong coming to your town, because he was a very famous person in his own right.
The club would eventually ease its restrictions on non-Norwegian members, and by the 1920s, it was known nationwide as one of the finest ski clubs in North America. In 1936, the ski club built the Big Nansen, a 171-foot tall ski jump that at the time was the tallest in North America.
Alf Halvorsen, who was the youngest president of Nansen Ski Club, he raised the funds to build the big jump up on the border of Berlin and Milan.
Anybody who was adept at coming down on a pair of skis off that jump and had the courage to jump off the end and could prove themselves, could jump off that jump.
It's a good fast ride. It's faster than a roller coaster. 'Cause you get your own control. You got to control your speed yourself, you know. Then you got to know what you're doing, because if you don't know what to do, you might as well not go there. You're going to get hurt.
That Nansen ski jump, I jumped off of there one time, and that was the last time. One day, another skier asked me if we'd go try the big jump. So we went up, and I tried it, and I gave it up.
You have to be careful here in Berlin, because if you come down and you had a crosswind, you were taking a ride in a stairways there. But me, I always watch what the direction of the wind when I look at the flag of the takeoff. If they'd wave me to go and I see the wind go across, I wouldn't go. I'd wait a little bit longer, you know, because you don't want to go down on a crosswind.
There was a lot of history there too, and as far as the Nansen Ski Club, with the jumpers that came in, there were jumpers from all over the country, all over the world actually. Good ski jumpers that came here.
That jump has been was used for years and years and years for Olympic tryouts and World Cup skiing, and it was quite the sight. I recall my best-a-more, my grandmother, telling me that back in the heyday of the ski jumping, the city of Berlin had 20,000 inhabitants, and 40,000 people would go to the ski jumping competition. So the city really exploded.
I remember they were saying, probably back in the 40s or 50s, saying that one weekend that they'd had the competition, there wasn't a drop of gas to be had anywhere in Berlin, because we just had so many people coming into town to see this.
If you knew the right people, you could get a pass and you could park close. If you didn't know, you had to walk a couple miles before you could get to it.
By the 1950s, the Nansen Ski Club had woven itself into the fabric of Berlin, and their annual Winter Carnival had become a major event that drew spectators and participants from miles around.
The Winter Carnivals used to be comprised of selecting a queen, having a parade up the street, inviting dignitaries into the area. A strong component of those Winter Carnivals was always focused on the Nansen ski jump and having ski jumping events where they would invite Olympic contenders and the best that the colleges had to offer in the way of ski jumping. They got the experience of what it was like to have winter activities in the North Country, like skiing and sledding and sliding and the ski jumping.
And I remember one year my parents telling me that there wasn't going to be enough snow for the ski jumping festivities. But a few days before the jumping came about, it started to snow. And it snowed. And they finally had enough snow that they were able to pull everything off. They were thinking of trucking in snow from somewhere, and they, of course, it had been kind of a dry season. But it snowed a while, and the ski jumping went off as planned, and everybody was happy. And it also generated a lot of income for the city. As people would come into town, gas up their cars, they would eat here. Of course, some would stay in the area, so it was definitely a moneymaker for the area.
It was called Hockeytown, USA. Tied directly to its French-Canadian roots, Berlin, New Hampshire was known throughout the region and Canada as the epicenter for ice hockey in the northeastern United States.
We'd get together and go to ice rink. They had ice rinks in different part of the city. And we'd get together and play some bang-up hockey, you know.
We had to go in the woods to get a limb that was the shape of a hockey stick. Use that as a stick. And then we used to keep out the catalogs and use that for shin pads.
I was in grammar school when I was 12, 13 years old. My father was a big hockey player all his life, and he wanted me to play hockey. I didn't know how to skate, so my dad wanted me to learn how to skate. So he built in our backyard a skating rink. And we had that skating rink for 12 years. I can remember my dad flooding below 0 nights. He's out there and I was helping him. And then the snowstorm scooping out. You know, we didn't have a snowblower. Couldn't afford a snowblower. So we were out there with scoops and shovels and cleaning off the rink. And I learned how to play hockey, and I turned out to be a decent hockey player. Not the best, but decent, you know.
In the 1910s, Brown Company backed mill hockey teams that played against each other throughout the winter months, and through the 1920s, the Berlin Athletic Association hockey teams were a powerhouse in the region. Berlin added to its reputation as Hockeytown, USA in 1937, when the Berlin Maroons Senior A amateur team was formed, and soon established themselves as a major force to be reckoned with.
When they had the big team, Berlin Maroon, and they had Lewiston and them, there used to be big crowds there. You wouldn't believe the line was there at 5 o'clock at night to go in the arena. Some night they had to stop because there was too many people to go in for the safety of the arena. They had to stop people coming in.
One of the greatest rivalries in New Hampshire hockey history was begun when Notre Dame High School opened its doors in 1941. They would soon become the home of the greatest high school hockey team in New Hampshire history, and the games between them and their bitter rivals, the Berlin High Mountaineers, were legendary. The Notre Dame Rams iced their first hockey team in 1944 and would go on to win an unprecedented 19 New Hampshire high school state championships between 1947 and 1972, including the very first state championship held in 1947.
Hockey history was rich here, with both Berlin High and Notre Dame dominating the state of New Hampshire in hockey. And when you picked up a schedule for the season, that's where you looked, as when Berlin High playing Notre Dame. And those were the biggest games here under our own roof, and more times than not we met down in Durham or in Concord or other places for the state championship.
We grew up going to the hockey games at the arena or watching Saturday night hockey. And of course you know everyone, and relatives are around, and everyone goes to the games, and it is very exciting. When Berlin ends up in a tournament game, it seems like the whole town follows them. It's so exciting.
When they used to have the two local schools play hockey, that used to be the big rival.
The rivalry would come to a head when the two teams faced off for the last time in an overtime thriller in the 1972 New Hampshire State semifinal game in Concord, with the Rams winning 3-2. Notre Dame went on to defeat Manchester Memorial High School in the finals 3-2. The Manchester Union leader later described the final game between the Rams and Manchester as the high school game of the millennium.
We beat Berlin High School twice in that regular season, at home undefeated, to a packed house. It was crazy. And then went on to the semifinals down in Durham and beat Berlin High School again in overtime, and went on to win our last state championship. And it was just one of the fondest memories we'll ever have as hockey players and students there. I can't describe it. I mean, it kind of chokes me up a little bit, because I remember it like I was there yesterday on the ice. We're very proud of our hockey heritage and history, and we closed the book on it in the right fashion.
Hockey was not only an activity for those who played, but it was a social event for the entire city. Ice hockey was played everywhere in Berlin, from the backyard rinks to the streets, but the gathering place for all was the Notre Dame Arena.
The euphoria of the arena, just because everybody knew everybody, it was great, just go out there and play your game. After the game, to get in that locker room, couldn't get in. People were all in there, hey, excuse me, can I change, Forget it, everybody leave, and oh, don't worry about it. And 5 hours later, Butchie Poirier's still there with his skates on, and the only thing he's got off is his jersey, and with locker room talk, and just a lot of fun, and the fans were great, to come, to watch us play,
Even though people didn't play, they still supported it, came to the game, line up and wait an hour or two outside in the cold to get into the game, and would drive to Concord or Manchester, Lewiston to catch the away games. I mean, we'd bring as many people to the away games as Manchester or Concord had in the stands. Truly remarkable. You don't see that. And when I had my kids, you didn't see other towns follow like Berlin follows, and they still do, and it's remarkable. That's culture.
It was always like a place to meet, We didn't always have to stay at the arena, but it was a place where somebody was playing, somebody said, we'll all meet at the arena, and from that point on, whatever we decided to do, we left, but that was our meeting point, more or less, and stuff, before we decided to go to somewhere else, or someone's house, or someone's camp, or whatever it was, but that was the place.
In 1969, Berlin would face one of its worst tragedies when the roof of the arena, weighted down by snow from recent storms, collapsed.
That night there was a high school game, but it was JV team that was playing. And that was the year of the big snowstorm, when we had the store 69 and 70. I was a referee, and I had forgotten my skates at home, so I called the other referee that was going to do the game with me, and that was Carl Langler. And I told him I'd be a few minutes late, And I got over there and rushed upstairs. There was a set of stairs. We used to go upstairs, and there was a balcony. And there was a door there. You could go out to a balcony. People would stand there to watch games. And I opened the door, and I hollered to Carl, I'll be right down. And I started to tie my skates, and that's when it happened.
I went to the game, went early, caught the warm-ups. Suddenly the lights went out, and there was like a crack, a crackle, and then the roof came down right in front of me. I just stood there frozen, like, oh my, the roof's coming down. And my friend said, Jackie, you better get down.
I had one skate on and I was trying to put the other one on, and I heard this big whoosh, and I could see lights coming down, all the lights coming down. I looked out the window, the lights were coming down. And then the roof come down and there was a whoosh, and the door flew open off the hinges right where I was sitting, looking out the balcony. And I was looking, there was another window there that went outside. I was looking at that window, and that's where I was going to go. And I mean, this is the worst experience of my life, I got to tell you that.
I just looked at the wreckage in front of me, and we worked our way down the bleachers. There was an emergency exit, and we just went out the exit, waited in a parking lot to hear news.
Then I got a hold of myself and one skate on and one stog, and I run downstairs to a phone booth. I called the police station right off. I told them, I says, the arena just collapsed and the kids were on the ice. Send everything you can over there. Within, I don't know, minutes, police department, the fire department, everybody was there. We knew the kids on the ice, so they finally decided by getting the kids together and who was there, who got out, who got off the ice in time, you know, who they were looking for and everything. So then we had to keep everybody quiet to see if anybody was stuck in there or something. And after a while, we heard one kid underneath all that top, all that stuff, and we got him out. The kid there, he was lucky. He was in between two big girders. We got him out, and the other one was a young bushy kid. He was my next door neighbor, and he was the goalie. Never made it. There's a girder that fell right on him. When we found him, I cut his pads off. I remember cutting his pads off to see if we could get him out, you know. And Dr. Dene, he was the physician at the time for hockey, you know. And he went like this. He said, don't hurry. No, that's something I'll never forget. I'll never, never forget that. And I knew the family, you know. They were neighbors, like I say, you know. The kid never made it. That was a real tragedy in town, real tragedy.
It really was a challenge, but as they say, the powers that be in town got together and formulated a committee and rebuilt this arena that now stands and having been refurbished. So we have a lot of hockey history with the buildings itself. It was really something to remember and go through.
By the end of World War I, Berlin was quickly becoming a central hub for business and leisure in the North Country. From the 1920s until the 1980s, Berlin's Main Street lived up to its name. Restaurants, movie theaters, and businesses of all kinds populated Main Street, making it the economic and social hub of the city.
You would go downtown on a Friday evening and the sidewalks were packed.
You couldn't walk. I mean, or you had to stand aside for somebody to get by or for you to meet them. The stores were all lit up.
To do their shopping, go to the movies, go to the restaurants.
I liked going downtown with my friends.
The main street would be jammed with cars.
Once we got our license, it was nothing to drive around that circle probably 20 or 30 times in the evening to see who the girls were walking here and there and stop and talk to people.
It was just more of a social thing, you know, just kind of driving around, getting outside, and seeing people.
If you didn't go downtown Friday night, you weren't with it.
When I was a teenager, we would shop on Main Street, and you could not walk 2 or 3 abreast because Main Street was just so busy.
We had a very strong presence of a number of major labels on Main Street. And when I say major labels, we had J.J. Newberry's, we had F.W. Woolworth's, we had W.T. Grant's, we had and still have J.C. Penney's. You had businesses like mine, and you had businesses like Gill's Flower Shop, and you had businesses like Valancourt Insurance that had been around multiple generations, and people identified with them as Main Street mainstays and were very comfortable coming in and doing business with those people and those entities.
I remember my mother saying to me when I was little, say, now if you and your sister are good girls, we'll stop by Emma's and have a nice ice cream soda or ice cream with hot fudge. And I mean, you look forward, it was a treat. Everything was a treat that we had. It was a wonderful city.
My brother, Navy, the oldest brother, was working with my father, built the most beautiful men's shop you'd ever want to see. We had all the men's lines. We used to sell Jarman shoes, Hartshafter Mark suits, Botany suits, Van Heusen shirts, Johnson wear. Had the nicest line of clothing that people would love. And of course, you let them charge.
Goodrich's. There was a restaurant and a soda fountain. Delicious sodas, you know. I can almost taste one now. Downstairs is where he made all his candy, and he had a beautiful candy display on the side wall, and it was loaded with these beautiful chocolates of all. Oh, it's so good and fattening.
We would just go to different shops, Hallmark, and then, you know, you'd go to a shop and you'd say, oh, you just go to shops all day, but you would go and then you would see someone you know, so then you would have those conversations and you would talk to, you know, the people who own the shops, and they would know what was going on with you in high school, and they'd ask you questions about, you know, how you're doing.
My great-grandfather got involved in retail. The retail that he got involved in was a shoe store, and his second oldest son, my grandfather, took that business over and essentially ran it for him. So it would have been the third generation, my grandfather, that really developed the roots of what we now know as Moran's Shoe Store. And he invited my father in to work with him, and he invited me in to assist him. As it turned out, I stayed in the business, and I still run that business today.
One of the French Canadians, his name was Nat Tarian, and he used to sell hot dogs. He had a little steamer that he'd walk up and down Main Street and holler in French, hot dogs, hot dogs, hot dogs. And they were good.
We had 3 movie theaters, Princess Albert and Strand Theater. Strand was a new theater. It used to be a Moose Club. They made a bowling alley out of it after they had the theater. But when it's a bowling alley today, but it was a movie theater, Strand Theater.
When I was a kid growing up, Saturday was a big treat. We'd get money to go down to the matinee, Princess Theater, movie theater. The matinee, Saturday matinee show. I mean, we were there every Saturday. It didn't matter what was playing. You know, Godzilla, King Kong versus all those good, you know, creature feature movies and stuff, whatever it was. And it was great. Elvis Presley movies. Get a popcorn and a soda and the movie.
Most of the Jewish people in Berlin owned stores. They were selling men's clothes. They had women's clothes. And then we had a doctor in Berlin that was Jewish. And we had a butcher store. There were 2 butcher stores, the Rosenfield.
After school, it was with friends, going to Woolworth's. There was a lunch counter there with, you know, snacks, treats, soda pops, and root beer floats and that.
Woolworths had the old Woolworths shop had the nice like diner, and they had the my favorite soda there was the orange, the fountain soda, orange. Oh, great! I remember that as a kid.
Middle Earth was a shop that we used to go to a lot. We used to go to restaurants.
There was also a restaurant that was quite popular on the east side. It was called Cinna Restaurant. And Mr. Cinna was a nice guy, and he just let you go in his store and just talk and just have a Coke, and the place would be packed with high school kids going right onto the sidewalk outside the store.
And the Cinnabaldi, when they first started his restaurant, in fact, he started to make a pizza. My mother's the one that gave him the recipe for his pizza.
When I think back at some of the vibrant activities that happened in the downtown area, I can remember my brother and myself dressing up as presidents on President's Day and walking up and down the street with the sandwich board signs, attracting business to the fact that we were having a President's Day sale. We were always out there on the street. We had something called sidewalk sales, and we would be out there on the street. My dad would have us come down and stand on the concrete and enjoy the bright sunshine and get a wonderful suntan as we were out there representing the shoe store during the sidewalk sale days. And that was always great because it was as much a social event back then as it was a sales event, but it always drew a lot of people downtown.
So, you know, it was really, really hopping, and yet it was a friendly, close-knit atmosphere about it as well. It was really something to see. There was, people were close.
We had everything going. The mill was going full steam ahead. Everybody was working. It was unbelievable. The town really was an exciting, exciting town.
From the end of World War II to the 1960s, the city of Berlin was at its peak. The paper mill, Converse rubber, and other successful businesses created the economic heart of the city. The population was steadily up near 18,000. Winter events that attracted thousands to the area were a regular occurrence, and the Berlin Maroons and Notre Dame Rams were the toast of the region. But economic troubles were just around the corner for the jewel of the North Country. The late 60s saw urban renewal come to the city, but it would never live up to the promise of attracting more businesses to the area.
At the time, we didn't care for it too much. We thought it was a waste of government money. People weren't given the true value of the homes. My parents' home was valued at about $20,000, and they only got about $7,000 for the house from the federal government, and they had no choice. They had to move out quickly and find another home. The opinion at the time was it took away a lot of good tax-paying property, property that was bringing in tax income for the city of Berlin. But the prediction was that what was going to replace it was going to bring in more taxes for the city. Of course, that didn't work out for a long, long time.
In 1968, the Brown Company was sold to Gulf Western, and the first reduction in the workforce took place, shrinking from almost 3,000 down to 1,600. The population began to slip as well, and by 1970 had fallen to about 15,000 from its peak of 20,000 back in the 1930s. Like in many other industrial cities across America, the recession of the 1970s hit hard, and Berlin soon saw its fortunes change for the worse. New EPA regulations began to cost the paper industry millions of dollars, cutting into profits and forcing more reductions in the workforce. The downward spiral had begun, and in 1972, the Catholic Church closed Notre Dame High School due to the shrinking student population.
That was a sad day when they decided to close Notre Dame High School, because it really changed the aesthetics of our community. I believe that firmly and strongly.
The beloved community club would close in 1973. And as the population began to leave, so did the small businesses on Main Street. And the once vibrant heartbeat of the city began to fade as storefronts were boarded up and closed. The Converse Rubber Company, which had thrived since the 1940s, closed in 1979, dealing another hard economic blow to the city.
After Converse Granite State Division closed, and of course more people moved out. And it was, you know, we knew everybody, and like I worked in stitching, so it was mostly women. We brought up our kids together. And It became like a social thing. We had our parties and all that. You know, we knew our bosses. We saw them all the time. They were like our neighbors. I missed the girls a lot after it closed down, you know, because we were family.
Bass Shoes made an attempt to bring the shoe industry back to Berlin, opening a factory in 1981, but it would close in less than 5 years. In 1980, the James River Company purchased the mill and began to sell off the thousands of acres of woodlands owned by the original Brown Company. The workforce was reduced once again, and major portions of the production were shipped out of the country to places like Mexico, while wood crews were eliminated and major segments of the mill's work was subcontracted. In 1994, another company, Crown Vantage, was spun from the James River Corporation, further reducing the workforce.
In 1979, the Brown Company was bought by James River Corporation. In summers of 1981 and 82, when I was in college, I worked there, and you could see a lot of the computerization starting to take place, the mechanization. But I remember them saying, you know, this is going to be eliminating a lot of people's jobs. And that's when a lot of us started saying, I guess that's what progress is all about. By the mid-'80s, people were starting to see that the paper company, the paper industry, was starting to become challenged. By the mid-'90s, there was talk about the mills closing. And the sad thing was, one of the corporate policies at the time, not only for James River but for Crown Vantage, was let's blame the workers, let's blame the workforce. They're not productive enough. The sad thing was that they were productive, and they really gave an honest day's work for whatever job they did at the mills. The sad thing is that the global economy had already caught up with Berlin. I remember a lot of us, you know, buying James River toilet paper and seeing Made in Mexico on the wrappers. And a lot of us would just be in disbelief and just asking ourselves, why is this happening? We used to make everything here. The Nybrock towels, the toilet paper. I mean, we did everything here. But because of globalization and the need for profits because of the stockholders, they started moving a lot of their operations down to Mexico. And when you start seeing something like that, it doesn't take long to realize that the writing's on the wall. And that was the beginning of the end.
By this time, the population of Berlin had shrunk to about 10,000, half the size of its 1930s heyday. The city was becoming a shell of its former self, and the pulp mill, the very business that stood as the pillar of the community, was about to close forever.
It was going to be our night, that the end of production was going to be on our shift. So we had talked before about getting the last sheet off the production line and getting everybody to sign it that was in the mill that night. So they finally called me and said, Joe, we just shut the dryer down, the last sheet came off. So we pulled it. I had the guys sign the sheet. We dated it, and then we went and took it to all of the other departments so that everybody that was in the mill that night would sign it as a piece of history, the end of an era. It was not a happy time, but I must say that the crews were all very professional in doing their jobs. They knew that the end was near, that that was it, that they were part of history of Berlin, and that was the last sheet coming out. There would be no more, and that shortly down the road they would be out of work and unemployed. They were also very professional about it. They could have, you know, gone off the deep end and done a lot of things, but they didn't. They just stayed the straight and narrow. They all did their work. They knew it was going down. They drained the tanks like they were supposed to. They shut everything in an orderly manner, and were very professional about it. So no, I can only praise those people and the crews, because they're the ones that really made it. It wasn't myself or Roland Lamontagne or anybody else. It was them. They had a lot of pride in this mill.
A lot of them ended up going to southern New Hampshire, getting jobs in construction sites where it's seasonal work, so which I'm doing right now. A lot of people are traveling. You know, they leave on Monday morning early and do their job 410s or 5/8s, whatever, and then they come back on Friday and they're here on the weekends, and you know, because they still have their house over here. It's tough for these people because they have to maintain a job, and you know, and to try to find a job too. Right now with me, I'm lucky my wife works at Car Freshener, which we have insurance. Otherwise than that, no insurance, and at the age of 52, you know, for me, that's a tough position to be in.
There were some that, myself included, we took jobs that took us up to Woodland, Maine, 300 miles away, you know, working construction. It was just, you did what you felt you had to do to support your family. Some people found work locally, but there were a lot of guys and girls that had to travel a distance to work.
It was always, the mill is never going to close, so no one needs to worry. And then when it did happen, it was overwhelming for everyone. It was unbelievable. And then to realize that you have to find a new career at 40, some 50, some even 60 is just devastating.
I'm getting older, and you know, they're looking for younger people. So we'll just hang on and take it day by day, see what happens.
I've seen guys really get depressed when the mill shut down, especially the unskillful ones. I was one of the lucky ones that had a skill. You know, I had a welding background, so I was able to get out in industry and get a job right off. Some other people, some of the paper makers and you know, like laborers, whatnot, didn't have any kind of skill, so it was tough on them. And now I'm currently a welding instructor at the Berlin High School, local high school here in Berlin. Yeah, so, and I also instruct a welding instructor for the community college, White Mountains Community College here in Berlin also.
I've been at the college for 26 years. When the mill closed down, the college, along with outside agencies, partnered and developed training programs for the individuals who wanted to retrain and find new careers. We have helped a number of people from the mill, and they have gone on to new careers and are very happy. Change is not easy, and they've faced many challenges, both financially, personally, and academically. And so we've helped them and guided them through all of those, and to see them graduate is quite a reward.
You know, families for years and years and years went to the mill, ran their whole career, and now that's not true anymore for the most part, so they've had to reinvent themselves. The mill, what it did for the town and for people is taught them good work ethic. And from there, they were able to get other jobs because of their work ethic. So I think that's important, that Berlin, people aren't afraid to work, and they work hard, and that's part of the culture here is the blue-collar, hard-working families. And so they were able to, whether they have to travel to Conway or to Littleton or to Nashua or Concord, wherever it may be, Portland, Maine, they land jobs because of the good work ethic, and they can do a number of things. And the mill was good about teaching people a number of different skills, so that if it did close, you can move on and find another job if that's what you choose to travel. And if you choose to pick up and leave, then you do that too.
It was the bread and butter for most families in Berlin. It was the wives and children who worked in the restaurants and grocery stores, but the men, it was their bread and butter, it was their life, and very dependent on the mill.
As the 20th century came to a close, Berlin's future was in doubt. When the pulp mill was finally sold to a demolition company in 2006, the centerpiece of this once proud city was torn down, forcing the population to face the reality that the paper industry would no longer be the foundation of its social and economic fabric.
It was difficult times here in Berlin. The paper mill changed hands 4 or 5 times over the last 20 years. And every time that the paper mill changed hands, there was always that hope that that was going to continue and continue to provide good employment for lots of people. But when the pulp mill was finally sold to a demolition company and most of it was demolished, I think that finally broke the mold and broke the mindset. And I think the majority of the residents here in Berlin are ready for Berlin to take a new direction.
It was an end of an era. The mill was part of our life. It was, it was a symbol of the town, the paper mill of Berlin and everything. And then when they finally did fall and stuff and they fell, it was an end of an era,
I can remember going to watch them blow the stacks. Rain. We were thousands of us standing in a constant rain, and the stacks would go down. And I'm sure there were some men that worked in the mills that had tears in their eyes when these stacks went down, because that's what they made their living.
When the building started coming down, it broke my heart. No worse than my dad. My dad, his front porch, you can view the pulp mill perfectly, and he lives up on the hill. And it broke my dad's heart, because I remember my dad telling me, son, when I got my job, when I got hired in 1974, the year after graduating, my dad had told me, son, you're all set for life. They will never shut this mill down. You're in, you get it made, you start a family, buy a house. You can live here the rest of your life, secure a job. But it didn't happen that way. Change is scary. It really is scary.
If you go right down here on Main Street by St. Anne's Church, if you just stop there and listen, you can hear the water. You can hear how fast the water runs there, because there's really a big drop there. And it's almost like you can still hear the mill. It's almost like a ghost of the mill there. That's how I feel anyway when I walk by there. It's like, listen, you can still hear the mill. Even if it's not there, you can still hear it. Isn't that cool?
At the beginning of the 20th century, Berlin's forefathers created an industrial city through sweat and an honest day's work. Now, 100 years later, the people of Berlin will have to summon that same grit and determination in order to save it. With the legacy of the Brown Company and all that it brought to the city, the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of Berlin's mill workers, farmers, dairymen, and shopkeepers have begun to craft their future, looking to build a new sense of purpose for Berlin and bring a renewed vitality to the city that trees built.
What has to be captured is the hard work of the people that kept this community together as long as it did. We have people who worked hard in the mills, who had a lot of pride in their work and wanted their children to have better than what they had, and that's what my parents wanted for me.
The old saying, what goes around comes around. I believe that, I really do. And it'll go around, and then somebody else will come in and start something else, and that'll click. Somebody else will click, another click. One thing you know, it'll start all over again. And you can only hope and pray that this will materialize, because it has to. It really, really has to. And we can only keep our fingers crossed and hope and pray for the best.
I am eternally optimistic. I see a Main Street at this point that is bruised. I see a Main Street that is struggling with a very, very challenging economy right now. But I also see a very strong and diligent core of entrepreneurs who are very much interested in seeing the Main Street continue.
Every street corner, every street, every area that I go through has good memories for me. And there are a lot of ghosts here that I feel very comfortable with. When I sit in my office on the second floor at the Sawmill, I look out over the cemetery and I see the grave of my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, and my 5 uncles, all within sight. And that's a kind of, some people would find that morbid, but I don't, it's a testimony to the fact that people have stayed here and put their lives into this community, and it's been rewarding for them.
Berlin is my home. I mean, no matter where I go or what I do, if I go back there, it's just that sense of home. I'm hopeful for the future of Berlin. I think it's had a rough time, but I do think that there's enough people up there who really want to bring Berlin back to the life that it was.
It's a especially friendly town with really an awful lot of really good people, wonderful people. And I have been privileged to know a lot of these people that are, some I've lost, but some are still here. They're still a lot younger than I, but they're still, you know, it's been my privilege to live here.
It's just nice to be associated with a community that your family has had so much to do with over the years. Because like in our particular case, both of my sets of grandparents came from Canada to find a new life, and they did. And they afforded us this ability to be here and to have that life. And I think we all, and each in our own way, we all feel we have a stewardship to be able to prolong that and to make it, even though it's not as good as it would have been at one point, we've always been optimistic. And we always say, well, today maybe wasn't the greatest day, but tomorrow it'll get better. And I think that's one of the things I like about Berlin is its optimism. We've always been optimistic that even though yesterday wasn't as good as it could have been much worse. And tomorrow will definitely be a better day. And if we can make our town such that we can keep it as a haven for future generations, we're all committed to that.
But we were strictly French. My grandfather could not speak a word of English, so that made us speak more French. And I went to the Guardian Angel School where Judy wasn't going, and like she said, it was mostly French through the whole day and stuff. And we grew up on the East Side, and everybody knows the best hockey players came from the East Side. I have to throw that in.
And the words to the Norwegian national anthem are some of the most beautiful words of any national anthem. Not just because it's Norwegian, but because it talks about the homeland. Ja, vi älskar detta landet som det stänger fram. Yes, I love this land, my country, land of home and kin. And then it goes on and talks about hem de mor or far, the home of my mother and father.
My skinny was digging the puck out of the corner. There was a couple guys there, and I would come out with the puck. But like I said, I used my stick quite a bit, sometimes illegal. They used to call me the hatchet man.
So if we played in the river, we went north, and we had friends up in Norwegian Village, and above, say, Bridge Street, the river was flat, and you could swim up there. And it was a big thing to go out on the logs in the spring. The river would be full of logs, and you shouldn't be, but you'd run out and run across the logs, and you'd cross the river on the logs.
Ski, the
On 12th Street, they had a little ski area right here in town, and there was a rope tow that killed my arm. Some kids could just nicely go up there, but I was one of those all bent in two. But I would get up there and then bomb that hill. So we had a great time doing that too.
Yeah, because Saturday mornings, they'd always have either a wedding or a funeral. And the priests were stuck. They didn't have an altar board. Back then, altar boards was a big thing back in my days. So the priest would call, of course, across the street. We lived right across the street from the church. Can Dennis come and do a 10 o'clock funeral or a 10 o'clock wedding? So I'd be out there, my buddies playing hockey. Dennis, you gotta go do a funeral or a wedding. Oh, Mom, come on. You know, it was funny. But great memories of that. You know, I mean, that's, we still talk about it when we visit my parents today. They're both still living, and we mention that, you know, reminisce. We reminisce the old times, and it's super, you know, it's great.
Looking for a nut.